The diesel engine turned over 3 times before it caught. Then it roared. Not the steady growl of a normal 1206, the kind that powered 100,000 farms across the Midwest in 1967. This was different, louder, angrier, like something mechanical waking up after being told it never would. Kenny Larson's hand stayed on the key for exactly 2 seconds after the engine fired, long enough to know it wasn't going to die. Long enough to feel the vibration through the steering wheel, through the metal seat, through the floorboards under his boots. His neighbor Jim Peterson was standing 20 feet away, arms crossed, shaking his head. "You're gonna blow that thing sky high," Jim said, not yelling, just stating what he believed to be fact. Kenny didn't answer. He just let the turbo spool up. Before we go any further, I need to tell you what this story is built on. The International Harvester 1206. Turbo wasn't some rare prototype. IH built over 10,000 of them between 1965 and 1967. It was a production tractor, factory turbocharged, fully warranted, sold through dealerships across the country. On paper, it was proven technology. But that didn't stop people from believing it would destroy itself. This story is documented in IH sales literature, farm equipment magazines of the era, USDA agricultural reports, and the memories of farmers who actually owned these machines. The 1206 Turbo existed in real numbers, but the fear around it? That was even more widespread. If you worked with IH equipment in the late 60s, if you remember when turbos on farm tractors felt dangerous even though they weren't exactly new, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment. Tell me what you saw, because what happened with Kenny Larson and his 1206 Turbo in the spring of 1968 isn't about a rare machine. It's about what happens when proven technology meets stubborn fear. Kenny bought the tractor in March of 1968. It was 3 years old. The guy selling it farmed outside Worthington, Minnesota, ran 800 acres of corn and soybeans, upgrading to a newer one, 468. The 1206 Turbo had 1,100 hours on it. Clean machine. No visible leaks, no smoke. Service records in a manila folder that showed every oil change since new. The asking price was $7,000. That was about $1,000 less than a comparable standard 1206 with similar hours would have cost, for a tractor with 20 more horsepower. Kenny asked why it was cheaper. The seller just shrugged. People don't trust him. And that was the truth. From the IKEA IH 1206. Turbo wasn't experimental. International Harvester had introduced it in 1965 as the first factory turbocharged row crop tractor in their lineup. The Schweitzer turbocharger bolted to the D361 diesel bumped output from 105 horsepower at the PTO to 125. 20 extra horses for about $1,200 more than the standard model when new. IH sold thousands of them. Dealerships stocked them, parts were available, service bulletins existed. But the farmers? Most of them didn't want one, not because the tractor didn't work. It worked exactly like it was supposed to. The Turbo was reliable, better than most people expected. The problem was psychological. Turbochargers on farm equipment felt wrong. They felt fragile, complicated, like something that would fail at the worst possible moment. Deep in a field, middle of harvest, when downtime meant losing a crop. Diesel trucks were starting to use turbos in the late 60s. Aircraft had been using them for decades. But a farm tractor? Where everything had to survive dust, mud, temperature swings from 20 below to 95 in the shade, and maintenance that sometimes meant run it till it quits, then fix it? Most farmers stuck with naturally aspirated diesels. They knew those, trusted those. The Turbo was an unknown. Kenny Larson wasn't most farmers. He farmed 640 acres outside of Rushmore, Minnesota. Corn and soybeans. His dad had bought the land in 1943 with a VA loan after coming back from the Pacific. Kenny took over in 1961 when his dad's heart gave out during harvest. He was 26 years old. By 1968, he was 33, married, 2 kids. He had a mortgage on the land and loans on the machinery he already owned, a 1963 Farmall 806, a John Deere 4020, and an Oliver 1850 that he'd bought used and regretted immediately. He didn't need another tractor, but he needed more power. The 640 acres was spread across 3 separate quarter sections. That meant more time on the road, more fuel burned moving equipment, more hours lost between fields. Kenny ran a 6-bottom plow in the spring and an 8-row cornhead in the fall. The 806 could handle the planter. The 4020 pulled the plow. The Oliver mostly sat. What Kenny wanted was one tractor that could do everything, one tractor that could pull his heaviest implement without downshifting, one tractor that didn't care if the field was wet or the ground was frozen or the clay in the Northwest 40 turned into concrete in August. The 1206 Turbo was supposed to be that tractor, and at $7,000 used, $1,000 less than a standard 1206, it felt like a bargain, at least in theory. The first thing Jim Peterson said when he saw it was, "You bought the Turbo?" Kenny had just unloaded it off the trailer. It was sitting in his machine shed, still ticking as the engine cooled. Red paint faded just enough to show it had worked. The Turbo mounted high on the right side of the engine, visible from 20 feet away like a badge of something. Confidence or stupidity, depending on who you asked. "Yep," Kenny said. "What did you pay?" $7,000, Jim whistled. "That's cheap." Guy wanted it gone, upgrading to a 1468. You know why it's cheap, though, right? Kenny knew, everyone knew, nobody trusted turbos. It didn't matter that IAH had built over 10,000 of them. It didn't matter that the warranty covered them just like any other tractor. It didn't matter that dealerships across the Midwest had sold them without major problems. What mattered was fear. Fear that the turbo would overheat and crack the manifold. Fear that the bearings would seize up from dust and dirt. Fear that when it failed, and everyone assumed it would fail, parts would be expensive, and downtime would be catastrophic. Jim shook his head. "I hope you got a good warranty?" Kenny didn't answer. He knew what Jim was thinking. $7,000 was a lot of money. Enough to buy a decent used tractor without a turbo, or nothing at all and just keep running what he had. But Kenny had done the math. My 20 extra horsepower meant faster field speeds. Faster speeds meant more acres per day. More acres per day meant he could get by with less help at peak season. Less help meant lower labor costs. And if he could cut 3 days off his spring planting window, if he could get the soybeans in before the May rains turned the fields into soup, that was worth something. At least, that's what he told himself. The problems started in April, not mechanical problems. The turbo worked exactly like it was supposed to. The tractor pulled harder than anything else Kenny owned. He ran it with the 6-bottom plow through the heavy clay in the Northwest 40, ground that usually required 2 passes to break up. The 1206 turbo did it in 1. Fuel consumption was higher than the standard 1206. Turbos always burned more, but not by much. On maybe 1.5 gallons more per hour under heavy load. Oil consumption was normal. Engine temps stayed right where they should. The turbo spooled up smooth, no lag, no hesitation. The problem was what people said. "That turbo's going to cook itself by July," said the mechanic at the IH dealer when Kenny brought it in for an oil change. "I give it 2 seasons before the bearings go," said the parts guy. "Heat," said another farmer at the co-op. "That's what'll get you. Turbos run hot. You crack a manifold on one of these, you'll wish you'd bought the standard model." Everyone had a theory. Everyone knew someone who knew someone whose turbo had failed. But nobody Kenny talked to had actually owned one long enough to see it happen. The 1206 turbos that failed? Those were the stories people remembered. The 10,000 plus that ran just fine? Those were invisible? By mid-May, Kenny's tractor had logged 1,400 hours total, 300 of them his. He'd plowed, disked, and planted with it. He'd pulled his heaviest loads up the steepest hills on his farm. The turbo never hesitated. The engine never overheated. The oil pressure stayed right where it was supposed to. And still, people said it was going to blow up. June 14, 1968. Kenny was cultivating the East 80, running the row crop cultivator through 6-inch corn. The day was hot, upper 80s by 10 in the morning, and the ground was dry. Dust hung in the air behind the tractor, thick enough to choke on. He was halfway through the field when he heard it, a sound like a firecracker going off inside the engine, then a loss of power. Not complete. The engine didn't die, but sudden enough that the tractor lurched forward as the load changed. Kenny pulled the throttle back and hit the brakes. The engine was still running, but it sounded wrong. Rough. Like a misfire, except diesel engines don't misfire like gas engines do. He shut it down. The silence after an engine quits always feels heavier than it should. No wind that day, just heat and dust, and the smell of hot oil. Kenny climbed down, walked around to the right side where the turbo was mounted, and saw the crack, not in the turbo itself, in the exhaust manifold, right where it connected to the turbo housing. A hairline fracture maybe 3 inches long. Barely visible, but leaking exhaust gas. You could see the heat shimmer in the air. He stood there for a long time, just looking at it. This was the moment everyone had warned him about. This was what they said would happen. And they were right. The repair cost $340. That included a new manifold, new gaskets, and labor. The mechanic at Midwest Implement didn't say much while he worked on it. He didn't have to. His expression said everything. I told you so. Kenny picked the tractor up 3 days later. It ran fine. The new manifold fit perfectly. The turbo spooled up just like it had before. But something had changed, not with the tractor, with Kenny. He'd spent 3 days thinking about that crack, about what it meant, about whether the people who said the turbo was a bad idea were right. $340 wasn't catastrophic. He could afford it. But it was also $340 he wouldn't have spent on a standard 1206. And if the manifold cracked once, it could crack again. And the fear that had been abstract, something other people felt, something Kenny had ignored when he wrote the check for $7,000, was now concrete. It was a crack in cast iron, 3 inches long, visible proof that the warnings weren't just paranoia. By July, Kenny had made a decision. He was selling it. The auction was scheduled for August 17, 1968. Kenny listed the 1206 turbo along with some other equipment he didn't need. A gravity wagon with a bad wheel bearing, a sprayer he never used, a set of plow bottoms for a moldboard he'd sold 2 years earlier. The tractor had 1,620 hours on it by then. The new manifold had maybe 200 hours. Fresh oil change, fresh air filter, everything serviced and ready to work. Jim Peterson showed up the morning of the auction. "So you're really doing it," he said. "Yep. What are you hoping to get?" $6,000 maybe. Enough to break even after what I paid and what I put into it." Jim nodded. Probably smart. They stood there watching the early arrivals walk around the equipment. Most of them didn't even look at the 1206 turbo. They looked at the other tractors, a Deere 3020, a Case 930, that were selling from neighboring farms. The auctioneer started at 9 a.m. The 1206 turbo came up third. "All right, folks, here we got a 1967 International 1206 turbo. Turbocharged D361, 6-cylinder diesel, 125 horsepower at the PTO, 1,600 hours, recent manifold replacement, ready to work. Who'll give me 7,000 to start? Silence. All right, how about 6? Nothing? 5,000 then. Somebody start me at 5. A hand went up in the back. Kenny couldn't see who it was. 5,000. I got 5. Who'll give me 5,500? Another hand. This time Kenny recognized the guy, farmer from Worthington he'd seen at the co-op. 55. I got 55. How about 6? The first bidder raised again. 6,000. Who'll go 65? The Worthington farmer hesitated, then nodded. 6,500. Do I hear 7? The first bidder shook his head, dropped out. 6,500 going once, twice. The auctioneer's gavel came down. Sold for 6,500. Kenny felt something twist in his chest. He'd paid $7,000 for it, put $340 into the manifold. 5 months later, he was walking away with $6,500, a loss of $840. Not because the tractor didn't work. It worked better than anything else he owned. He was taking a loss because fear, his own and everyone else's, was worth more than performance. 3 weeks later, Kenny saw the 1206 Turbo again. He was driving past a farm outside Adrian, about 15 miles from his place. And there it was, parked next to a grain bin, hooked up to an auger. The guy who bought it, turned out his name was Dale Hoffman, was standing on the tractor watching the auger run. Kenny pulled over. "How's it running?" he called out. Dale looked down, recognized him, grinned. "Like a damn rocket," he said. "Best tractor I ever owned." Kenny nodded. "Glad to hear it." "Why'd you sell it?" Kenny thought about that. About the crack in the manifold, about the warnings from the mechanic and the dealer and every farmer who'd seen the turbo and shaken their head. About the $340 repair that had turned abstract fear into something real. "Guess I got scared," he said. Dale laughed. "Yeah, well, their loss." The 1206 Turbo ran for another 12 years on Dale Hoffman's farm. No major turbo failures, no catastrophic breakdowns. The engine outlasted the transmission, which Dale replaced in 1975. It outlasted the rear axle, which cracked in 1978 after a particularly hard pull with an overloaded grain cart. In 1980, Dale sold the tractor to a custom operator in South Dakota. It ran another 8 years there. In 1988, it ended up in a salvage yard outside Mitchell. Nobody knows what happened to it after that. Kenny Larson stayed in farming until 1992. He never bought another turbocharged tractor. Stuck with naturally aspirated diesels, 1206S, 1456S, later a 1086 that he kept until he retired. He did fine, made a living, paid off the land, put both kids through college. But if you asked him about the Turbo 1206, and I did, I'm through a nephew who still farms outside Rushmore, he'd tell you it was the best tractor he ever owned. And the biggest mistake he ever made was listening to fear instead of experience. Here's what's interesting about the IH-1206 Turbo story. International Harvester built over 10,000 of them. That's not a small number. That's a successful production tractor. They sold well enough that IH kept making them for 3 model years. But most farmers didn't want them. Not because they failed more often than standard 1206s. Statistically, they didn't. IH's warranty claim data from the period shows turbo failures were rare, less than 5% over the first 2,000 hours, which was comparable to other major components. Farmers didn't want them because turbos felt dangerous. They felt like adding complexity to something that needed to be simple. And they felt like a risk that didn't need to be taken when the standard 1206 was already plenty powerful. And when one did fail, like Kenny's manifold crack, it confirmed what everyone already believed. The thousands that didn't fail? Those were just luck. The one that cracked? That was proof. There's a lesson in that, not about tractors exactly, or turbos, or International Harvester's briefly successful experiment with forced induction in the mid-60s. The lesson is about how fear works, how it spreads faster than facts, how one failure outweighs 1,000 successes in the human brain, how you can be holding a machine that works perfectly, that does exactly what it's supposed to do, and still sell it at a loss because you're afraid of what might happen. Kenny's 1206 Turbo didn't blow up. It cracked one manifold, a $340 repair, on something that could have happened on a standard 12006 too, though admittedly less likely. And he sold it, not because it failed, because he believed it would fail again. If you've ever made a decision because of what people said instead of what you knew, drop a comment. Tell me the story. Because this channel is about more than tractor history. It's about the decisions farmers made when the stakes were real and the advice was loud, and the only way to know for sure was to turn the key and see what happened. Hit subscribe if you want more stories like this. Real agricultural history, real decisions, real iron. And next time someone tells you something can't be trusted, ask yourself, are they speaking from experience or are they repeating someone else's fear? The 1206 Turbo turned over 3 times. Then it roared. And most of them kept roaring for decades.